I'm Hallie, and we're coming on the air right now after a big and busy day of breaking news with a lot of new details we're getting from 3 senior Trump-appointed Justice Department officials. You heard some of it if you've been watching our coverage, if you've been watching that hearing, testifying live to the country about this push by former President Trump to try to put a loyalist in charge of the Department of Justice, somebody who was sympathetic to his lies about the election, trying to falsely overturn those 2020 election results in several states based on some debunked conspiracy theories. So a few buckets we're going to talk about here. Let's break this into our biggest takeaways as we have just wrapped this hearing and we head into the next phase of this communication from the Select Committee. First, right, you've got kind of a tale of 2 Jeffreys here. First, Jeffrey Rosen, the acting attorney general at one point. He only served for about a month. He took over for Bill Barr at the end of December 2020. He accepted what the DOJ had determined, that there was no evidence of widespread fraud that would have influenced the election. On the other hand, you have this other Jeffrey, Jeffrey Clark, a character that was very present, if not physically, then at least in the conversation here in the hearing today. This is the person that Donald Trump wanted to replace Rosen with. And if you want to know what some people thought of Clark's qualifications, this is how former White House attorney Eric Hirschman summed them up. Watch.
And when he finished discussing what he planned on doing, I said, good. Excuse me, sorry, a-hole. Congratulations, you just admitted a first step or act you take as Attorney General would be committing a felony and violating Rule 6C. You're clearly the right candidate for this job.
Okay, that is sarcasm, in case you didn't catch that. And that soundbite that you just listened to is really important because it draws a link between Jeffrey Clark, remember, somebody who Donald Trump wanted to take over the DOJ, with the knowledge from another attorney that what he was trying to do was illegal, was a felony. That's important. Tuck that away here, okay? By the way, we just found out that Clark yesterday got a visit from federal law enforcement officials. We'll talk about that in a second. So keep in mind that if Clark had taken over the Department of Justice, that could have given legitimacy to these totally made-up lies about election fraud. And if he got that job, then the committee, you could have seen, actually, false letters to 6 states that President Biden won, the Department of Justice would have sent to withdraw their results, again, based on this conspiracy. Those letters actually got drafted. We saw them. And according to Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue, so this is another person who testified today, Clark was basically conducting this shadow investigation. He was calling his own witnesses. He was trying to get a national intelligence briefing, for example, on some of these lies. And Donoghue was very clear that he told the former president these claims had absolutely no merit.
I felt that being very blunt in that conversation might help make it clear to the president these allegations were simply not true. As the president went through them, I went piece by piece to say, no, that's false. That is not true.
Okay, so that's another bucket takeaway here, right? Bucket 2, which is that Donald Trump was told by DOJ officials that these conspiracy theories that he was taking action on were not true. But keep in mind, look at this. Jeffrey Clark's influence was so big at this point. We found out the White House call logs already showed him as the acting attorney general on January 3rd, 3 days before the insurrection. He never had that job. That was never a job that Clark actually had. But this is the way that Donald Trump wanted it to go. Another important takeaway that we learned today, the committee is confirming now publicly for the first time that it did speak with former Trump White House counsel Pat Cipollone. Remember, this is somebody who Congresswoman Liz Cheney said the other day they want to hear from in a formal deposition setting. The committee now says they've heard from him informally, and they talked about some of what they learned from Cipollone. Remember, White House counsel, he was in all these meetings. He has knowledge of these conversations and of what Donald Trump knew when. Donoghue says he was told by Cipollone, that this letter drafted by Clark was basically a murder-suicide pact. That's what he told the president, because so many people in the Department of Justice would resign if Jeffrey Clark ended up taking over. Donoghue also turned over, by the way, a bunch of information, a bunch of notes from calls that he had with former President Trump, with others, saying various things, including, for example, that he knew that former President Trump wanted to put Jeffrey Clark in place, was talking about some of these conspiracy theories. So let's get right to it. I want to bring in some of our team who is standing by out in the field and here in 30 Rock, Ali Rafa, who is live on Capitol Hill. Harry Littman is with us, too, our legal analyst. Ken Delanian outside the Department of Justice as well. And in a minute, we're going to bring in Chuck Todd for some more analysis. Ali, let me start with you. And reaction that we're getting now that this hearing is over. I understand Congressman Kinzinger is going to speak to reporters. If it didn't already happen, I expect it'll happen momentarily. What's been the takeaway just in the last couple of minutes since this hearing has wrapped up on the Hill?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway from this latest hearing, Hallie, was really this presidential pardon nugget, and that's what we're specifically noticing some reaction coming in. As a matter of fact, already Congressman Mo Brooks, who has been actually subpoenaed by the committee after being asked to voluntarily testify and provide information as far as his role in January 6th. We learned that he was among several GOP congressmen who asked President Trump for a presidential pardon for their role in January 6th. Among those others are Matt Gaetz, Mo Brooks, Andy Biggs, Louis Gohmert. And so we also learned more about Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry, who the committee really laid out was the reason for Clark being brought into the White House, this Trump loyalist who former President Trump wanted to replace Rosen with at the top of the DOJ, this institution that for decades has made it a point to try and distance themselves as an independent entity from the executive branch, from the presidential office, even though it is in the executive branch. And like the committee laid out, Trump really wanted the DOJ to do his bidding. And the committee really going into how former President Trump even said, quote, leave it to me and these Republican congressmen, really using them as a vessel here to do his bidding again, Hallie.
Hallie, thank you. Harry Littman, let me bring you in here because there's a couple of questions that I have for you from the legal perspective. First of all, one of the revelations from this hearing today, this is really another big bucket, another big takeaway. It happened right at the end, so let me tell folks about it, is this idea that members of Congress, some of these Republicans, as Hallie mentioned, were looking for pardons. So Matt Gaetz, Mo Brooks, Marjorie Taylor Greene, according to some of the testimony there. Jim Jordan never specifically asked for one, but alluded to the idea of pardons. We're now hearing from Congressman Brooks, and just looking at my email because it has just come in, and Hallie well knows this from her work on the Hill team, that Mo Brooks has said he would appear in front of the January 6th committee if that deposition was shown publicly and could be public. Help us understand why it is so significant that you have some of these members of Congress who are involved in this scheme that are now asking, that had been at the time, asking to be pardoned, that we're now learning about.
So, look, there is some issue of saying you ask for a pardon, you've got some criminal consciousness of guilt, and that is part of it. But the big thing that happened today was this conspiracy, which we knew only in a top-line way. It was shown to be so sprawling and involving so many others. So I think the really big thing about these 5 members is what they were doing that caused them to say, I want a pardon here. And as you say, 5, and starting with Matt Gaetz. So it's the conduct and the way in which Scott Perry, we know about specifically, the actual plan has them deeply involved in trying to do what is plainly a crime, that is to say, a fraud on the United States to overthrow the election.
You bring up Scott Perry, and just so people understand here, he is somebody who made that connection between Jeffrey Clark, this DOJ official, and Chief of Staff at the time, Mark Meadows, which obviously got him into former President Trump's orbit here. His office has previously called it a soulless lie that Perry ever asked for a pardon. We anticipate we'll see more threads from this from the committee. But I also want to ask you about Clark specifically, because this is somebody who was, after being told by his boss at the time at the Department of Justice, technically still his boss, Jeffrey Rosen, that he was sort of out of line here. He continued to make calls to people. He asked for a briefing from intelligence officials. Does Jeffrey Clark, in your view, have any legal liability, Harry?
Oh, yeah, big time. And I think he's also made to order as a potential cooperating witness. You got to understand, Jeffrey Clark is essentially a non-entity. He, on the flow chart, doesn't really go very high. He's just someone, Trump is any port in a storm. He latches onto him through Perry, specifically because Clark agrees, because of his ambition, to let himself be used in this lie. And I just want to say, as a former DOJ person, Hallie, this one left me completely breathless because it got so close. Everywhere else, Trump is sprawling around doing whatever he can. This was the width of a paper. That paper goes out. People in Georgia and 6 other states say, DOJ thinks it, maybe there's a problem. And you can really see how the dominoes at that point would have fallen and would have left Trump potentially in power.
I take your point to the fragility of the dominoes, if you will, Harry. We saw Jeff Rosen and Rich Donahue pulling basically all the fire alarms, convening a call with then the next level of Department of Justice officials to basically take a roll call and say, hey, if I jump, you jump, right? And they all agreed that they were out if Jeff Clark came into place. Ken, talk a little bit more about that, what you're hearing from the DOJ. And I think critically, this piece of news that we got today, that just 24 hours ago, roughly, federal authorities were at Clark's house. Tell us more.
That's right, Hallie. According to a witness who is Jeff Clark's boss, it was actually they conducted a search. They took him out of his house in his pajamas and seized his electronic devices, which suggests they had a search warrant, which would mean they convinced the judge there was probable cause to believe a crime had been committed. And usually they do that when they believe a witness is trying to hide evidence and not submitting documents in response to a subpoena. But look, I completely agree with Harry. That hearing today was breathtaking because of how close we came to an absolute disaster. The letter to the Georgia legislature that was the whole purpose of this conspiracy that Trump wanted the DOJ to send out, essentially saying that they had found fraud when in fact they had not found fraud. That letter was a dagger aimed at the heart of our democracy. And had it gone out, there likely would have been civil unrest that made January 6th look like a picnic. And the only reason it didn't happen is because courageous people, many of them appointed by Donald Trump, stood up and said, we're not doing this. We want no part of this, and we will resign if you try to appoint this guy and make him attorney general. I'm standing in front of the Department of Justice. I always watch these hearings with an eye towards what are the prosecutors getting out of this. If they ever do bring a case against Donald Trump, and we're a long way from that, a lot of the testimony and evidence we heard in this hearing will be a big part of it. But one thing the hearing did not solve today is the question of whether Donald Trump had criminal intent. Because what we never heard from any of those witnesses today, Hallie, was anybody saying Donald Trump knew he was lying. He told us he knew he lost the election, but he wanted to assert these claims of fraud anyway. That's going to be a key piece of evidence if they ever decide to bring a case against Donald Trump.
Ken Delaney and Harry Lippman, Ali Rafa, thank you. Let me bring in Chuck Todd now, who I've had the pleasure of spending the last 4 hours of our lives with together, Chuck, as we watch this hearing unfold. I know that one of your big takeaways is something we've heard reflected from both Harry and Ken, which is the sheer scope of what we saw unfold as it related to this pressure campaign on the DOJ, the former president's push to try to install basically a loyalist at the top. For people who may be going, wait a second, Hallie, like, you have a million names, you're talking about a lot of people, like, give me, what do I need to know coming out of this hearing? What would you tell those folks?
Look, today was the day that you learned how operational this, what the president was actually trying to do. He was trying to create legitimacy to his allegations. And, when you start to see and you said that people have been making, that this really was a multifaceted attempt, and there really is structure to it, right? They started at the courts, they tried with the states, and then they realized they needed cover. And the Justice Department was the best place to get cover, right? They couldn't get the FBI operational or U.S. Attorney's operational without the legitimacy from the Justice Department. It's pretty clear that Bill Barr didn't want to be a part of this, which may be why he walked. And then all of a sudden we're in this situation where the president they ended up with a loyalist from the White House counsel's office, found their way to the Justice Department, the Congressman Scott Perry, who seemed to be intricately involved. It's like the president had his own sort of team trying to maneuver around folks like Mr. Rosen, the acting attorney general, in order to try to get what he wanted. And I guess the way I would describe it, today's hearing's the closest, and I said this earlier, which is I think the C word has gotten thrown around too much, the word coup. But today's the day where we were right at an operational moment. Had in that meeting, President Trump decided, nope, I'm firing you guys. You're out. But he's the acting attorney general. And then that letter goes out. And while the letter itself, people will get convoluted, it's the letterhead. Because what the headline would have been and all over the news, the Justice Department, right, has weighed in. Yes. And that would have had an impact. It would have created phony legitimacy to this, would have gotten more people comfortable, perhaps, in Congress carrying the president's water here. It would have absolutely immediately created a constitutional crisis. But this is where Rosen and Donahue deserve a ton of credit, and Engel, because they didn't just tell them they'd resign. They organized, they made sure they had that department ready to go. And you and I both know President Trump well enough. He's savvy enough to understand what that would have looked like at that moment. That's right. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, what I'm so struck by, because you bring up Mr. Engel, it's not even like this meeting is hours and hours. And again, you have interviewed Donald Trump. I used to cover him. You know, things can go on for a long time in a freewheeling way.
Always with him.
It was like one comment, according to the testimony today from Mr. Engel, this idea that it would be a graveyard at the DOJ. You heard the people testify, Donahue and Rosen, that it was that comment that changed the game. That at that point, Donald Trump seemed to be deeply affected by that. And I'm so struck by the thought of, what if Steve Engel didn't ever make that comment, right? What if that point wasn't made and struck Donald Trump in that way, right? Would the meeting have turned out the way that it was? When you talk about this point that it came so close to the edge.
Yeah, look, I do think what Engel was able to at least penetrate Trump's brain of realizing that the optics of this would have been a disaster. Yeah. Everything that he was hoping to get would have worked the opposite way. You'd have had Senate Republicans walking away almost in unison, other than the 4 to 5 that sort of are always willing to carry his water, and it would have probably made things a whole heck of a lot worse for him. So the fact that he was self-aware enough to listen to Mr. Engel, I think says something. And look, it may be the reason why he's never personally charged with a crime, right? Is that he got, as Lester and you and I were talking earlier, what did Danny call it? Buffers, right? Like the way the heads of mobs are very careful. It's sort of like they have a whole bunch of other people doing the dirty work where they technically didn't commit any crimes here, but he certainly went right up to the line on that day, to a line that even Richard Nixon wouldn't go to.
Chuck Todd, thank you. Appreciate your analysis. We'll do it all again, I guess, in a couple of weeks, Chuck, whenever we find out when the next hearing is. Appreciate it, friend. See you back in D.C.
Bye now.
Coming up here on the show, some really angry reaction, especially here in New York, where I am today, after a landmark Supreme Court decision today on guns. We'll tell you why it could mean more people with guns when they walk the streets of the city. That's coming up. We are back, and we have just heard President Biden reacting to that big Supreme Court decision to knock down a New York law that had put some strict limits on carrying a gun in public. The court, the justices, saying states cannot force people to have a special need, so-called, if they want to carry a gun outside their home. So just now, we've heard from the president saying he is disappointed with this decision. Watch.
I think it's a bad decision. I think it's not reasoned accurately, but I'm disappointed.
He also basically told states to start taking matters into their own hands by putting, in his words, common sense laws in place to make their citizens and communities safer, says the president. We've heard from New York City's Mayor Eric Adams and New York Governor Kathy Hochul, who say that's exactly what they plan to do.
We do not need people entering our subways, our restaurants, our movie theaters with concealed weapons. We don't need more guns on our streets.
And we cannot allow New York to become the wild, wild west. We are prepared to set an example that will lead the country of how do we fight back on this decision.
Sure, this was such a big decision because it's not like we hear from the Supreme Court all the time about gun issues. New York had tried to argue that the law was in place to protect it as a, quote, sensitive place, some place that's public and busy like New York City. But the justices, in a 6-3 decision, came back and said, no, that doesn't have merit. That there's no historical basis for New York to, declare the island of Manhattan a sensitive place just because it's so densely packed, because it's so crowded. I want to bring in Pete Williams right at the moment. Pete, let me start with you here, and we may have more coverage on this as the show continues. We're seeing a lot of reactions now to this ruling. Can we talk next steps here? Because now that it's happened, it doesn't go into effect immediately, right? So it's not like tomorrow this concealed carry law in New York is going to see changes, or help us understand that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to understand is why the Supreme Court said this. They said, first of all, that the Supreme Court's decisions about guns mean that the Second Amendment isn't any different than any other part of the Bill of Rights. You don't have to show some special need to exercise your First Amendment right or your Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial, and the Second Amendment doesn't work that way anyway. Now, the court does leave open the possibility of restricting guns in sensitive places, and it also says states can still require licensing to get these permits, and you have to undergo a background check and a mental health check and show that you have had firearms training and so forth. But the biggest part of the decision, I think, and this is where you talk about going forward and the president urging states to take steps to pass their own laws, is what Justice Thomas said. I'm just looking at the language specifically. He said that it's not enough for local governments to say that they are imposing restrictions on guns in order to protect public safety. He said gun regulations must be, quote, consistent with this nation's historical tradition of gun regulation. Now, that sets a very high bar, and that may call into question not only future gun restrictions that local governments want to impose, but ones that are already on the books. So we may be seeing now years of new litigation over not only forward-looking laws like red flag laws and things like that, but also gun regulations that are already on the books.
Pete, stand by for a second. I alluded to perhaps more coverage, and it looks like we have it with Ron Allen, who is joining us now from here in New York. Ron, I think you're with us at the moment. Yes, can you hear me okay? Let me stand by, Ron. Ron, I'll stand you by. And Pete, let me go back to you for a second, because, you know, one of the issues, you've talked about this sensitive places discussion, right? How much of an impact, if any, is what the Supreme Court decided today going to have on what we're seeing back home in Washington on Capitol Hill, which is this discussion over a package on gun legislation?
Well, I mean, immediately none, because in order for this to work out, you would have to have Congress pass these laws and then someone challenge them and lower court rulings make it to the Supreme Court. So as a practical matter, if Congress does pass these restrictions, assuming that no member of Congress now decides not to support the legislation because of the ruling, whatever Congress does will remain on the books for a couple of years until the next round of cases get to the Supreme Court, if any of those are challenged. But by setting, you know, what is the historical tradition of red flag laws? What's the historical tradition of enhanced background checks? I mean, I think that's where a lot of the action is going to be in the years to come here, and why this is such a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal for two reasons. One is it's the Supreme Court saying for the first time in American history, yes, the Second Amendment, when it talks about keep and bear arms, means guns outside the home.
That's right.
Remember, it was 14 years ago that the Supreme Court said you could have a gun at home for self-defense. So it's a big reason. It's a big deal for that reason as well.
Okay, so let me pull back and get you on the broader picture here, right? Because you have this moment now where today with this guns decision, what we anticipate sometime in the coming days or weeks, which is a decision on Dobbs, which could overturn the landmark abortion rights ruling Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court is at the center of these incredibly politically relevant issues. At a time when you are seeing in some of the polling trust in the Supreme Court overall since, for example, March, let's say, having dropped in the eyes of the American people. I wonder, as somebody who's covered the court for a long time, how you see this moment the justices are in.
Well, I think what you see here is the conservative majority on the court now, the conservative supermajority with 6 votes flexing its muscles. The court was confronted with this very question about guns outside the home repeatedly. And when Justice Anthony Kennedy was still on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still on the court, it didn't want to go there. Now that it has this conservative supermajority, it did want to go there, and it got the result that conservatives were looking for. So, I think you're going to see the same 6-3 vote breakdown in the decisions yet to come. We have 9 cases left. We're going to get decisions again tomorrow. We'll get decisions probably Monday, maybe more days next week, and maybe into July. I think you'll see this same 6-3 pattern on these big cases.
Pete Williams, thank you so much for being with us, Pete. I know this was a big day. Appreciate it. Let's talk about what else is happening in Washington, with the White House making some more moves to try to get gas prices down. Today, you had the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, meeting with oil refining company executives. With the meeting coming as the Biden administration wants oil companies to explain why aren't they making more fuel available. Both Granholm and the company say today's meeting was productive. Right now, the national average for a gallon of gas is $4.94, according to AAA. That's 7 cents cheaper than a week ago, right? That's good. That's 7 more cents in your pocket, but it is still 34 cents more than a month ago. And a year ago, you were paying only $307. NBC's Josh Letterman joins me now from the White House. And Josh, we've heard now from both sides about how this meeting went. The Energy Department says that the secretary reiterated the president's call for them to do more to make sure their companies are passing savings on. Folks from the oil side of it say today should send a positive signal to the market that the U.S. is committed to a long-term investment in a strong refining industry and aligning policies to reflect that commitment. How, lovely and polite? OK, sure. Give us the nitty-gritty, right? What's the real promises on action here moving forward?
There are none. There's nothing concrete or specific coming out of this meeting. Both sides describing it as constructive, Hallie. But you know how these White House readouts of meetings work. If you call something productive or constructive, that's about the bare minimum of saying it didn't completely go off the rails. But we have no indication that there was any real agreement about concrete steps that either side could take in the wake of this meeting. And in fact, that statement that you mentioned from the oil industry talking about long-term investments, I think that is a very clear indication that the oil companies are continuing to make the same case privately to the White House and to Secretary Granholm that they are publicly, which is to say, look, you can't on the one hand be saying we are moving rapidly away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy like wind turbines, which the president showcased at an event today, and at the same time say that these oil companies should be spending huge sums of money to build new refineries to produce more oil, when the White House is saying in the same breath they don't want Americans to be buying that oil in the medium to long term. And so there's a fundamental disagreement here between the two sides about how to solve this problem, and we don't seem to be any closer to a resolution to that.
How about this federal gas tax holiday? This is something that this week we heard the president talk about. We heard less than vociferous enthusiasm from Congress about it, at least not so far. What's the latest status update on that?
Well, the White House is continuing to stand behind this proposal, even as nobody in Congress is really running to hold a vote on this or to endorse the idea. And we're also hearing from groups like the American Society of Civil Engineers saying, look, you start to get rid of that tax or put a holiday on that tax, you start depleting the Highway Trust Fund, which means we can't have the same amount of money to maintain the very roads that we want more Americans to be able to afford to drive on. So the White House still wanting to show that they are doing everything that they can, calling for what steps they can, including this holiday, to try to lower gas prices, even though there are no signs that Congress is going to move quickly to act on that proposal.
Josh Letterman outside the White House. Josh, good to see you. Thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, help is starting to arrive in Afghanistan after that powerful earthquake killed at least 1,000 people so far, absolutely destroyed some villages. It's hard getting that help there to where it's needed, though. Remember, this happened in an area where there's a lot of mountains. It's pretty remote. People are still looking for survivors. Number 2, today the FDA formally ordered Juul to stop selling e-cigarettes and to take them off store shelves. The agency says there's insufficient and conflicting data on how toxic the products are. A Juul official says the company disagrees with the FDA's findings. Number 3, a judge signing off on a more than $1 billion settlement in that South Florida condo collapse that killed 98 people last year. It's Surfside. Most of the money will go to survivors and families of victims as they approach tomorrow now, the 1-year mark since that collapse happened. Number 4, pretty scary moment for a swimmer at the World Aquatics Championships in Budapest. Artistic swimmer Anita Alvarez, representing the U.S., appeared to faint in the water. She fainted. She started sinking to the bottom of the pool after her routine. Look at this. Her coach, fully clothed, by the way, dives in to rescue her. It was an unbelievable moment. Alvarez's coach says she's now doing okay, which is great. Number 5. Arch Manning, Eli and Peyton Manning's nephew, has announced his college plans. The quarterback committing to the University of Texas, as speculated about. He's the top recruit in the class of 2023. If you're wondering when you might see him in the NFL, he's not going to be eligible for the draft until 2026. But you know, a lot of people will be looking at any QB with the last name Manning. Still to come. Title IX transformed sports for women and girls. And now, 50 years to the day since it became law, there's a fight over whether its protections should extend to transgender women and girls. I spoke with folks about this in a story we go in depth for coming up next. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, officials in West Virginia say 6 people died Wednesday in a helicopter crash there. Our local affiliate reports the chopper was from the Vietnam era. It was being used for tourism. The NTSB is now trying to figure out what specifically went wrong. From our Northeast Bureau, prosecutors in New Jersey say rapper Lil TJ was shot multiple times during an attempted robbery at a shopping center. Another man was also shot. Police have arrested a suspect on attempted murder and robbery charges. Both of the victims were taken to a hospital. NBC News has reached out to the rapper's reps for comment. We'll keep you posted. From our West Coast Bureau, a swimmer has been hospitalized now after being attacked by a shark off the coast of California. It happened about an hour south of San Jose in Pacific Grove. Police say the victim had some pretty significant injuries. People nearby tried to help get him to shore. We don't know the man's condition, but obviously something we're keeping an eye on. We are here now tonight on the 50th anniversary of a landmark law that propelled women's equality in America forward. President Biden today, with the Department of Education announcing a proposal of sweeping changes that would give unprecedented protections under Title IX to transgender students. Keep in mind that 50 years ago, Title IX reshaped women and girls' rights as the law made sure that most schools, colleges, and universities, any that received federal money, could not discriminate against them. Now, these proposed new regulations just rolled out today would recognize that transgender students are also covered by Title IX, and it would roll back the Trump administration-era rules to expand sexual assault survivors' protections. The president's move comes as there is now a fierce discussion over what should happen as it relates to trans women and girls in girls' sports. We looked into this. Watch.
My favorite snowflake of city.
9-year-old Kieran Clausen collects crystals. She dabbles in face paint, and she loves sports.
What do you play?
I did play volleyball, soccer, and I want to play basketball.
To Kieran, who's transgender, it's not about racking up victories.
I don't want to win any trophies for it, though. I feel like that's the most unfair way to compete because it's not about winning.
What's it about?
Having fun with your friends.
But next week, her state, Indiana, will ban trans girls like her from playing girls' sports, joining at least 15 other states with similar laws. Now, the Clausens' only hope is that the courts will step in.
It's tough. It's hard to do everything that you can to support your child and then have lawmakers come in who don't know anything and say that you're doing the wrong thing for your child. It's really hard.
It's very personal. Lawmakers are attacking one of the smallest minorities that we have.
Title IX is so important to our family, and it's not just for sports. It's so that she is not discriminated against because of her identity.
50 years ago today, Title IX became a landmark law banning discrimination against women and girls in most schools. But the fight now centers around whether that federal right should extend to transgender students.
It's very sad that Title IX has kind of been warped to include biological males when it should be protecting biological females.
Chelsea Mitchell is one of 4 student athletes suing the Connecticut Association of Schools, now appealing the case's dismissal, arguing the state violated their Title IX protections by letting trans girls compete against them at track meets.
From the moment I stepped foot on the track in my first race, I fell in love with the sport.
What about young transgender girls who are also falling in love with track? Should they be denied the same experience that you've had?
Everyone deserves the opportunity to compete. It just needs to be done where it's most fair, and women's sports need to be kept as women's sports.
This week, swimming's global governing body effectively banned trans women from competing in women's events, only letting swimmers compete in them if they transitioned before age 12. The decision coming just a few months after Leah Thomas made history as the first trans woman to win an NCAA swimming championship.
It is a policy that we need to introduce in order to protect the competitive fairness of our event.
LGBTQ advocacy groups slamming swimming's latest move as discriminatory.
Do you think the fight for Title IX is over?
Oh, I think it's absolutely still an active fight. And the progress that we made, everything, I think, is up for grabs.
As some of the sports world's biggest superstars, like Billie Jean King and Megan Rapinoe, work to fight anti-trans laws, like the one about to go into effect in Indiana, where the Clausens live. We told Rapinoe what Kieran told us.
She just wants to play with her friends. What's your message to her?
Oh, gosh, we're with you. And it's like emotional to think about. I mean, this kid's, so young. She just literally wants to play with her friends.
For Rapinoe, it's personal.
God forbid a trans person excel in sports. I would rather have that than have kids committing suicide at 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 15 years old because they can't even live with themselves because all they've ever been told about themselves is that they're gross, they're horrible, it's unfair, it's not all about elite sports. And coming from someone who's elite, I would literally give up everything that I've ever achieved for not one of these kids to feel what they're feeling.
Kieran seems undeterred with a message now about her journey.
Never stop being you. That's it.
Never stop being you.
As hard as it is to be vulnerable, sorry, and fight publicly, there's so many kids that don't even have the opportunity to express who they really are. And so Kieran is brave enough and strong enough for us to share her story so that maybe people can learn and understand that trans girls are girls and trans boys are boys, and we are all human. We are acknowledging more people as who they are than taking something away from somebody else.
The Biden administration's new rules are all but certain to set up potential legal battles now with some of the states that are moving, like Indiana, to ban trans girls from girls' sports. We'll obviously stay on top of that story as the weeks and months go on. But for now, thank you for being with us. More coverage picks up as we speak.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.